Milk River Bench, Montana, August 1876. The sun baked the plains into a single, cracked sheet of brown stretching to a hazy horizon. On this canvas of unrelenting flatness, Callum Muir was building something that made no sense. He was building a circle. With a rope tied to a central stake, he had scribed a perfect 28-foot diameter into the buffalo grass, and now he was laying a foundation of river stone along the curve. He worked alone, his movements economical, his focus absolute. He was not building a house. He was building, in the words of his neighbors, a stone pot to be boiled alive in summer and frozen solid in winter. Norbert Veach, the land agent for this section, rode up on a bay gelding, reining in to watch. Veach was a man who understood the prairie in terms of straight lines, section lines, property lines, the plumb lines of a well-built wall. He saw the world as a grid, and on that grid, Callum Muir was an anomaly. Alongside Veach sat Jedediah Cole, a farmer from 2 sections over whose new clapboard house was the pride of the bench. "Still at it, Muir?" Veach called out, his voice carrying a tone of weary amusement. "Find any corners yet?" Jedediah Cole spat a brown stream of tobacco juice. "Damnedest thing I ever saw. A man needs a corner to brace himself against the wind, a corner to put his stove in, a corner to put a troublesome child." Callum placed a heavy, flat-faced stone onto the growing course, tapping it into place with a mason's hammer. He didn't look up. "The wind has no corners," he said, his voice a low burr of Scottish accent, almost lost in the vastness. "Why should my house?" Veach chuckled, a dry, dusty sound. "The wind, my friend, is precisely why we build with corners. A good square house stands firm. It has faces to meet the blow. This is a silo. It's a well. It's foolish." He shook his head, a gesture of finality. The community had rendered its verdict. Callum Muir, the quiet Scot who'd arrived the previous year, was a fool. A madman building a folly on the open plains, inviting the winter wind to peel his home apart like an orange. What did this quiet Scottish dyker, a man who had built stone fences for sheep on barren islands, understand about the physics of pressure equalization that the experienced carpenters and land agents of the Montana frontier had missed? The answer to that question would change how people survived on the northern plains. It would be written not in ink, but in stone and stillness, during the longest, hardest gale the territory had seen in a decade. If you stick with me, I promise you will learn the fundamental principle of aerodynamics that allows skyscrapers to stand and airplanes to fly, all demonstrated by a humble stone hut a century ahead of its time. Tell me in the comments, what's the strangest, most counterintuitive piece of folk wisdom you've ever seen prove true? I read every one. Callum Muir was not a carpenter. He had never framed a house, never sawn a joist, never shingled a roof. He was not a farmer, comfortable with the predictable geometry of plowed furrows. He was a dyker from the Outer Hebrides, a man whose hands knew the language of stone better than the language of men. His life had been spent on the wind-scoured headlands of Lewis and Harris, where the North Atlantic threw its full, unbroken fury against the land. There he had worked with the island's gneiss, a stone so old it seemed to hold the memory of the earth's creation. He had built sheep fanks, circular stone enclosures, and repaired the ancient sheilings, small, round huts where shepherds sheltered. His tools were simple: hammers, levers, and a deep, instinctual understanding of gravity and balance. He and his wife, Elspeth, had come to America seeking land, a place where their children, Iain and Morag, could own something more than a rented patch of stony ground. They arrived in Montana with little money and a wealth of hope, filing a claim on a section of benchland overlooking the Milk River. Their first winter, 1875, was a brutal education in the failures of conventional wisdom. They lived in a hastily built soddy, a rectangular dugout cut into the side of a low rise. It was a structure lauded by the land agents as the quintessential first home for the prairie settler, cheap, fast, and warm. It was none of those things. It was a trap. The prairie wind, finding the flat, western-facing wall of the soddy, pushed against it with the force of a battering ram. The pressure was relentless. Cold air, a substance as invasive as water, found every microscopic fissure. It drove through the mud-chinked logs of the doorframe and the poorly fitted window sash. Inside, life became a miserable calculus of survival. Elspeth stuffed rags into the gaps, but the drafts were everywhere. When the wind blew hard from the northwest, the tallow in their lamps would soften and run sideways on the wick, the flame guttering and threatening to die. A cup of tea set on the floor would show tiny ripples on its surface, a miniature ocean churned by the ceaseless, invisible river of cold air flowing across the floorboards. At night, the children slept in their coats, huddled together under every blanket they owned, while the door hinges shrieked with each powerful gust, a sound like metal screaming in pain. Callum watched, and he learned. He saw that the problem wasn't the cold. The cold was a constant. The problem was the wind. The wind was the engine that drove the cold into their lives. And the wind, he observed, had a favorite target: the flat wall. It was a battle of brute force. The wall stood rigid, and the wind pushed. The harder the wind pushed, the more the wall groaned, and the more cold it let in through the seams of its failure. All winter, his neighbors burned through enormous stacks of precious cottonwood, their stoves glowing red-hot, yet their cabins remained cold zones, their families perpetually chilled. By spring, Callum knew he would not build a house like theirs. He would not build a square box to fight the wind. He would build what his ancestors had built on the storm-lashed shores of Scotland. He would build a shape the wind did not know how to fight. He was not ignoring the local wisdom. He was applying an older, harder-won wisdom to a new place. He had seen what a straight wall did in a gale. It suffered. A curved wall, however, did something else entirely. It persuaded. The failure of the standard frontier cabin was not a failure of materials or effort. It was a failure of physics. The men who built them, competent and hard-working, understood wood and nails and bracing. They did not understand fluid dynamics. To them, wind was a simple force, a horizontal push. You met a push with resistance. A thicker wall. More bracing, more nails. They were trying to build a dam against a river of air, and the river always won. The core problem was net pressure. When a 50-mile-per-hour wind strikes a flat, 15-foot wide wall, it comes to a dead stop. Its kinetic energy converts into potential energy, creating a high-pressure zone against the entire surface of the wall. This pressure can exceed 10 pounds per square foot. On a single wall, that's thousands of pounds of sustained, relentless force, all trying to push the structure over. Simultaneously, as the air spills around the sharp corners of the building, it accelerates, creating zones of powerful low pressure, a vacuum, on the other three sides. This pressure differential, high on the windward side and low on the leeward, is what does the damage. It's not just a push, it's a push and a pull. The house is literally being squeezed and torn apart by the air itself. This differential is what drove the cold inward. The low-pressure zones at the corners acted like siphons, actively sucking warm air out through any available crack. It's why the corners of a cabin were always the coldest places, where frost would form first on the inside walls. The geometry of the square was creating the very conditions that made it uninhabitable. The settlers felt the effects every day. They heard the timbers of their homes creak and groan under the strain. They saw the flicker of their candles dance in the drafts. They watched their fuel piles disappear at an alarming rate. their stoves fighting a losing battle against an enemy their houses were designed to invite inside. They were living inside a physics problem they didn't know how to solve. And their solution, more fuel, more blankets, was merely treating the symptoms, not the disease. The disease was the corner. In the summer of 1876, Callum Muir began construction. He had spent the spring hauling stone from the riverbed, using a stone boat pulled by his single ox. He selected each one with a dyker's eye, looking for good faces, stable weights, and the occasional long, heavy piece that would serve as a through stone, tying the inner and outer faces of his wall together. He laid out the circle first, a perfect 28-foot ring on the prairie. The foundation was a wide trench filled with the heaviest stones, set tight and level. Then he began the walls. It was a double-walled structure, a technique ancient in Scotland but unheard of here. He built 2 concentric rings of stone, one for the exterior face, one for the interior. The gap between them, about 2 feet wide, he filled with smaller rubble and sod, creating a massive 5-foot-thick wall. This was not just for insulation, it was for stability. The weight itself was an anchor. His neighbors watched with a mixture of pity and contempt. They were used to barn raisings, to communal efforts where men worked together, their hammers rising and falling in rhythm. But no one offered to help Callum. They couldn't. "I can't lay a crooked line, Muir," said Silas Finch, a man known for his skill with a broadaxe. "My eye won't have it. A wall's got to be true." They didn't have the tools. Callum used a simple wooden scribe, a compass-like device, to transfer the curve from a template to the stones, ensuring a tight fit. To his neighbors, it was an alien instrument. They understood the plumb bob and the framing square. A curved line was a mistake to be corrected, not a principle to be followed. Norbert Veach made his objection official, as if speaking for the land itself. He visited the site weekly, his disapproval growing with each new course of stone. "You're wasting good material, Muir," he said, gesturing at the curving wall. "A flat wall braces itself end to end. The whole length of it resists the push. This thing—" He trailed off, searching for the right words of dismissal. "What holds it up? There's no purchase. The wind will find one weak stone on that curve and it will peel this wall open like a potato. It will unspool the whole damned thing." Callum paused, sighting along the top course. He pointed with his hammer. "The wind can't find one stone," he said quietly. "It must push them all. And it must push them all at once." He returned to his work, leaving Veach to stare at the inscrutable curve. The mockery lasted through the summer. The local children called it Muir's Folly. The men made jokes about it at the general store. But Callum worked on, stone by stone, course by course. He built corbelled arches for the 3 small window bays, another ancient technique that baffled the local builders, who knew only post and lintel construction. The roof was his greatest challenge, a shallow cone of radiating log rafters covered in sod. By the first frost of October, the round stone cabin was complete. It stood on the open bench, low and solid, like a natural feature of the land, a gray stone outcrop that had been there for 1,000 years. It had no sharp edges, no proud corners, no flat face to challenge the sky. It simply was. The physics behind Callum's round cabin was both profoundly simple and elegantly complex. It was the principle of pressure equalization, the same principle that allows a round bridge pier to stand in a rushing river that would tear a square one from its foundations. The structure wasn't designed to fight the wind with brute strength. It was designed to make itself irrelevant to the wind's force. When a stream of air, the wind, encounters a cylinder, it cannot stop. It must part, flowing around the object. As the air flows around the curved surface, it has to travel a longer distance than the air passing by unimpeded. To cover this longer distance in the same amount of time, it must accelerate. This is a fundamental law of fluid dynamics known as Bernoulli's principle, where the velocity of a fluid is higher, its pressure is lower. So, as the 50-mile-per-hour wind hit Callum's wall, it split. The air wrapped around both sides, accelerating as it did. This created two matched zones of low pressure on the sides of the cabin. There was no single massive high-pressure zone on the windward face, as there would be with a flat wall. Instead, the force was distributed around the entire 360-degree circumference. The direct pressure on the front was minimal, and it was perfectly balanced by the low-pressure zones on the sides and the slight eddying at the back. The net force on any single part of the wall was close to zero. Norbert Veach's critique, that the wind would peel a single stone out, was based on a misunderstanding of this principle. On a flat wall with mortar, that could happen. The wind could exploit a crack, get behind a stone, and use pressure to pop it out. But Callum's wall was dry stone. Its stability came from the immense interlocking weight. For the wind to move one stone, it had to move the entire, continuous, 88-foot-long ring of stone. The structure was a monolithic whole. The curve transformed the wind's linear force into a compressive, inward hooping force, making the wall stronger the harder the wind blew. It was the same principle as a Roman arch, turned on its side and wrapped into a circle. Furthermore, the absence of corners eliminated the low-pressure siphons that plagued his neighbors' cabins. There were no sharp edges to generate the vortices that sucked heat out. The air flowed smoothly, laminarly, around the structure. The cabin didn't confront the wind. It gave it a path of least resistance. It was an exercise in aerodynamic diplomacy, not warfare. Callum had built a home that didn't defy the gale, but rather negotiated with it, letting it pass by without a fight. The energy of the wind, which was tearing his neighbors' homes apart, simply flowed around his, its power undiminished but also unimparted. The winter of 1876 arrived with a vengeance. It began in late November with a series of snowfalls that laid a deep, powdery base across the plains. Then, on the 3rd of January, the temperature plummeted and the wind rose. It came from the northwest, a steady, malevolent gale that the old-timers called a bench scraper. For 19 days, the wind did not stop. It averaged 50 miles per hour, with gusts hitting 70. The temperature held steady at 18 degrees below zero. It was not a blizzard in the sense of falling snow, it was a ground blizzard. The wind picked up the existing snow and hurled it horizontally, scouring the landscape with a blinding 6-foot-deep river of ice particles. For the settlers in their square cabins, it was a living hell. The wind screamed at their walls, a constant deafening roar that frayed nerves and made sleep impossible. The fine abrasive snow was driven through every crack, forming long, feathery drifts inside their homes, outlining the door frames and window sashes. Families lived in a single room, huddled around stoves that devoured wood at a terrifying pace. Jedediah Cole's proud new house became a torture chamber. The north wall was so cold that a bucket of water placed near it would freeze solid in under an hour. His children were sick, their coughs echoing in the small, smoke-filled space. Twice he had to venture out to his woodpile, a journey of 50 yards that took him nearly half an hour, fighting his way back against a wind that threatened to knock him off his feet and freeze his lungs. Inside Callum Muir's round cabin, there was quiet. The thick, 5-foot stone and sod walls muffled the storm's roar to a distant low hum, like the sound of a faraway sea. There were no drafts. The air inside was perfectly still. Elspeth moved about her chores calmly, the flame of her oil lamp burning with a steady, unwavering light. Iain and Morag, healthy and warm, played on a sheepskin rug on the floor, their bare feet comfortable on the wood. The single stove burning a few pieces of cottonwood kept the entire circular space at a stable, comfortable temperature. They were consuming less than a quarter of the wood their neighbors were burning, yet they were infinitely warmer. The most profound evidence of the cabin's success was small and subtle. On a stone bench built into the inner wall sat a tallow candle stub. It had been there for 3 days, unlit. In any other cabin on the bench, the intense, penetrating cold would have made the wax rock hard and brittle. A press of a thumbnail would have snapped it. But here, in the deep thermal stability of Callum's home, the ambient warmth kept the tallow soft. When Elspeth touched it, the wax at its base was still pliable, pooling slightly under the pressure of her finger. The house was not just a shelter from the storm, it was an island of absolute calm, a place so impervious to the gale that it preserved the memory of warmth in a stick of wax. The storm raged for 19 days, but inside the round stone walls, it was as if it wasn't happening at all. On the 10th day of the gale, Norbert Veach was forced to ride out. A family 3 miles east of Muir's claim had failed to raise a smoke signal for 2 days, and he was duty-bound to check on them. The journey was perilous. The wind was a physical wall, and the blowing snow reduced visibility to less than 20 feet. His horse, a normally steady animal, was terrified, shying at the shrieking wind and the ghostly shapes of tumbling sagebrush that appeared and vanished in the white chaos. As he passed near Callum's property, a massive gust hit them. The horse reared, panicked, and Veach struggled to control it. He needed a windbreak, a place to calm the animal, before continuing. He saw the low, dark curve of Muir's cabin through the maelstrom. Cursing the Scots' foolishness but desperate for any shelter, he guided the horse toward the round wall, positioning the animal broadside against the stone on the windward side. The effect was immediate. Shielded from the direct blast, the horse quieted, its breathing ragged. Veach dismounted, keeping a firm hand on the reins, his own body pressed against the horse's flank. For a moment, they stood there, a man and an animal finding temporary refuge against a wall that shouldn't work. And then, a flicker of professional curiosity pierced Veach's anxiety. He wanted to understand the failure he was witnessing. He expected to feel the full violence of the wind transmitted through the structure, to feel the stones vibrating under the immense pressure, to hear the gale's scream conducted through the solid mass. He leaned past his horse and pressed his bare ear against the cold, gray stone of the windward wall. He braced himself for the roar. What he heard was silence. It was not a complete absence of sound. It was a deep, profound quiet, the resonant hum of immense mass at rest. There was no vibration, no shrieking, no sense of strain or struggle. He felt the biting cold of the stone against his skin, but he felt none of the wind's kinetic force. It was as if the wall wasn't there, as if the 50-mile-per-hour gale was simply flowing around him, ignoring the stone he was pressed against. The gap between what he expected to experience and the reality of the deep, solid stillness was so profound, it made him feel dizzy. His entire understanding of how the world worked, of how wind and walls interacted, collapsed in that single, silent moment. The proof was not in seeing, but in the absolute absence of feeling a force that was tearing the rest of the prairie apart. Stunned, Veach tethered his horse and stumbled to the cabin's single heavy door. He knocked, the door opened, and the contrast was a physical blow. Outside was a monochrome hell of screaming wind and flying ice. Inside was a circle of calm, warm, golden light. He saw Elspeth by the stove, a sleeping Morag in her lap. He saw young Iain carving a piece of wood on the floor. He saw Callum Muir, his face calm, rising to greet him. The air that flowed out was warm and still. "Veach," Callum said, his voice even, "you are in trouble." Veach could only nod, stepping inside, pulling the door shut against the storm. He took off his gloves, his hands numb, and stared at the curving inner wall. The silence in here was absolute. "My God, Muir," Veach whispered, his voice hoarse. "How?" Callum gestured to the wall. "It gives the wind no place to stand." Veach walked to the wall, placing his palm flat against the cool, dry stones. He looked around the unbroken circle, at the family living in a pocket of peace, carved from the heart of the blizzard. He finally understood. His own house, the agent's house built to the highest standard, was a battlefield. This place was a sanctuary. He looked at Callum, his eyes filled with a dawning revolutionary respect. "All this time," Veach said, his voice full of awe, "we've been building walls to fight the wind." He shook his head slowly. "You didn't build a wall. You built the eye of the storm." The great gale of 1877 broke the spirit of many settlers, but it became the foundation of Callum Muir's legacy. After his visit, Norbert Veach became the round cabin's most fervent advocate. He told everyone he met not what he had seen, but what he had felt, or rather, what he hadn't felt, against that wall. The story spread, fueled by the very real suffering everyone else had endured. The most significant convert came that spring. A survey crew for the Northern Pacific Railroad was working its way up the Milk River Valley, plotting a new route. The lead engineer, a man named Marcus Thorne, was a practical man of science, intrigued by Veach's enthusiastic but technically vague accounts. He rode out to see Muir's cabin for himself. Thorne, unlike the other settlers, immediately understood the principles at play. He walked the circumference, tapped the stones, and peppered Callum with questions about the foundation, the wall thickness, and the roof construction. Thorne spent 2 hours with a notebook and calipers, sketching the cabin's footprint, the corbelled window bays, and the radial roof design. "Mr. Muir," he said, snapping his notebook shut, "this is not a cabin. This is an elegant solution to a complex engineering problem." Thorne took his sketches back to company headquarters. The railroad was constantly building section houses and crew camps in the most exposed, inhospitable locations on the plains. The cost of heating these poorly built shacks and the loss of productivity from sick workers was a significant drain on resources. He presented Callum's design as a cost-effective, scientifically sound alternative. By that spring, the Northern Pacific had incorporated the round footprint into its official specifications for remote crew shelters. Before the next winter, 3 new circular stone crew camps, nicknamed Muir's Follies, with affection instead of scorn, had been built along the new line. They performed exactly as Thorne had predicted, saving the railroad thousands in fuel costs and proving the design's worth on a larger scale. The idea, once proven, became part of the local vernacular. While few individual settlers had the skill or patience to build a true dry stone circle, the core concept began to appear in other forms. Barns were built with rounded corners to prevent snowdrifts. Houses were sited more intelligently relative to the prevailing wind. The brutal lesson of the gale, filtered through Callum Muir's quiet genius, had permanently altered the frontier's architectural DNA. Callum's design was more than a clever building technique. It was a quiet rebuttal to the prevailing frontier ethos. The 19th century American mindset was one of confrontation with nature. A forest was an obstacle to be cleared. A river was a force to be dammed. A prairie was a wilderness to be tamed and gritted into submission. The wind, like everything else, was an enemy to be fought, a force to be met with thicker walls, bigger nails, and sheer, stubborn resistance. The round stone house stood as a testament to a different kind of wisdom. It anticipated by nearly a century the principles of modern aerodynamic design, where architects and engineers learned that it is often more effective to work with natural forces than to fight them. Tall skyscrapers are designed to sway and shed wind vortices. Airplane wings are shaped to create lift by manipulating pressure. These are direct descendants of the same truth Callum Muir knew in his bones. He did not build a fortress. A fortress invites a siege. It stands in opposition, a clear target defined by its flat walls and sharp corners. It draws the enemy's fire. Callum's home, by contrast, offered no such invitation. It had no front, no back, no vulnerable flank. It presented the same face to the wind from every direction. A smooth, patient curve. It was a statement of profound humility. It acknowledged the wind's superior power and chose not to engage in a fight it could never win. The lesson embedded in those stones was timeless. The conventional approach was to strengthen the wall against the wind, to add more material, more bracing, more force to meet force. Callum's solution was to change the definition of the problem. He didn't strengthen the wall against the wind. He gave the wind no wall to push. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found this exploration of historical engineering and physics valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories of forgotten innovators. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What other modern technologies do you see foreshadowed in old-world craftsmanship? Your engagement helps us continue to bring these histories to light. Disclaimer: this video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the building techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional engineering advice. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.